Alright, so in this video I want to go through some more of Unity basics. So we will cover mostly pivot points and spaces. So there's global space and world space, and we will also look a little bit at pivots. So first I will create a 2D sprite. Let's make a square. I will add that to my project like this, and I will just set it to the center, and then I will move it somewhere here, so I can just press Control and I can just move it like that. And you can see when I'm holding Control and I'm using this particular move tool, then it will start snapping to increments, and these increments, they can be decided here. So let me just change that to 1 so it's a bit more visible. So yeah, now it will snap to increments of 1. So it kind of appears like it's snapping to the grid. So I will do this. Let me just duplicate that. So Control D once and then move that here. So this is my 2 objects. So again, I can select them. So either here by selecting an object, pressing Control, holding Control, and selecting another one, and that way I can select 2 objects at the same time. I can also unselect them. If I will hold Control, I will unselect them like that. So so here I'm selecting them one at a time, and if I'm holding Control, I can select 2. If I'm holding Control, I can unselect them like that. So now I just want to make a little like radial pattern. So I'm going to select them, and you can see I can rotate them like that. So this is given that my pivot point is set to center, so it will basically decide where is the center between these 2 objects, and if I'm using the global option for my space. So yeah, if you have these settings selected like this, you should be able to press Control D and then generate more patterns like this. So I just want to make a little kind of like a clock face, basically 12 objects. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So let me select these. Again, I can select them by holding Control. I could also select first object, hold Shift and select last object like this, and I will select all of them at the same time. So now again, I just want to duplicate it, holding Control, and I'm rotating it like that, and I will do it one more time. And this is kind of like the pattern that I want to go for. So now if you select these objects, so notice the difference. So I can rotate my objects like this, so I'm rotating all of them at once as if it's one big object. So if I were to change it from center pivot point to pivot point like this, then I will be rotating them individually. Okay, and this is quite important thing to remember, because sometimes you want to manipulate the objects in a different way. And also similar thing applies for if I'm moving them. So I'm just gonna move them individually. So I could either move my object in the world space, right? So up, down, so left and right like this. Or you can see this object is rotated, so its up is actually this way. So if I were to change from global to local, then it will be like that. It's actually upside down in this case, but you can see I'm going along its axis like that, rather than in the world. So so when you're working with Unity, just decide what is it that you want. Do you want to move object in the world space, or do you want to move it in the local space like that? Okay. So this is a good start. So now I just want to maybe, let's say, if I wanted to add sprites or replace sprites, I can always do that. So let me just load up my sprites that I have made here. So this can go. And yeah, just have like sprite brushes that I made in Procreate. You can make your own brushes if you want in Photoshop or any other any other software. There you go. Right, so so you can see when I select my sprite. So here's a square. So here's the sprite renderer, and I can go ahead and I can replace my image, right? So here's, I'm replacing the texture itself, like that, right? So I can do it one by one, like that, or alternatively I could just select all of them, like this, and I can just drag and drop, you know, my desired image. So let's say like that. So I think in this case, like that looks pretty nice to me. And I can also start changing the color of this pattern as well. So, you know, all across the color wheel. If I want to change transparency, I can. So we have red, green, blue channel, and we have our alpha channel here. So let's just make it like semi-transparent like that. And so now I just want to make that into, so I'm going to add an empty game object. So create empty game object. And so this is just an object that has a transform. So basically I can move it, I can rotate it, and I can scale it, but it doesn't have any visual representation, right? So I could just like for demonstration's sake, I'm going to place it here, so it's definitely not in the middle of these objects, right? So I'm going to call this so my parent, and I'm going to take all of these objects here, and I'm going to drag them in here. You can see the cursor will change, and that way you can see I've made these objects so they are now children of this parent, right? So now if I move my parent, everything will move with it, because they are now their space now belongs to the parent, right? So we do have a little problem here. So here's my pivot point is set to a pivot, right? And if you remember, you know, my parent's position was here, so I did that on purpose, because now if I were to rotate it, it will rotate around this part here, right? I could always, at least in the scene view, I can always change it to center, and I can rotate it around the center, like this. But you typically would want to get rid of this, so, you know, if your parent is here, let's just make it visible. So here's my parent. I'm going to give it a label, so like a green label like that. So now, you know, this object will be only visible in the scene. It's not actually visible in the game. So you can see it's located here. I can always select my parent, go to game object, and there's an option here, center on children. And what that will do is Unity will, you know, do its best to move the object to the center of the where all the children are. So basically like the average position. So now this should be in the center. I think that's more or less center. And we could add maybe a little bit of a script that will move this object. So I'm going to create a C# script, call it simple rotation, like that. So here's my script. So basically I'm making a behavior that will be applied to my objects. So first let's open it and just give it a behavior. So I just wanted to rotate. Okay, so it's taking a little bit. Let's just wait. Okay, here we go. So here's my class. So it's very important when you write the class that the class name corresponds to the file name. It has to be exactly the same. So this has to correspond to that. If you somehow changed it, then your class is not going to be linked and it's not going to compile. But as long as they're the same, you should be good. So now So we have two functions here. We have a start function, which happens so before the first frame. So basically that happens once, like as the object appears on the screen. We're not going to use that. We have another function here, which is so this is called once per every frame. So as your game or any other project simulation is playing, on each frame something happens. So this is what we want to use for this tutorial. I would want to just use a simple rotation. So transform dot rotate 0 0, and let's do like 0.2f. So this is going to be my rotation on Z axis. So each frame is going to be the rotation will be added by 0.2. So let's just see what that looks like. So here's my object, and its current Z rotation is 0, and so every time I will be adding just a little bit, so it will be moving like that. So first things first, I would need to add my script to the object that will be using that script. So let's just, as an example, I will just press play, because clearly it's not added anywhere now. So I'll just press play, and this is our project so far. But now I will take my parent and I will add my simple rotation here, and let's press play and see what happens here. Okay, so you can see my parent is rotating. Okay, so I can turn that off, turn that on, and this is just the parent, right? So now let's just go to children here, and I'm going to attach this script here. It's the same rotation behavior, but I'm going to attach it to all of the children like that. So now all of them have it, right? So they're all using that rotation as well. So let's press play, see what happens. Okay, so we should get nice little pattern like that, spinning around, and you can see I can always turn off my parent rotation, so that way it will be only children executing this behavior, or I can have it on parent and on children, which is I think more fun. So then if you're creating like a little screensaver or something like that, you could potentially add more objects. So I'm just going to select my like squares. Well, they used to be called squares, but these sprites here, let's just call them sprites. And I'm going to go to center, global, and let me just add a bit more like that. So I just doubled them, so it should be 24 objects here. And yeah, and they all have script as well. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, so this pattern is a little bit more interesting. Now I could go in here, and I could maybe take my parent here, and I could duplicate it. So I'm just pressing Control D, and now I have a new object, and I'm going to just scale this up like that, and then I'm going to press Control D again, and I'm going to scale this up like that, and you can start making very interesting patterns like this. So you can see we have our behavior here. So additionally, what you can do, let me just remove this. So let's say I have this object here, and I'm going to duplicate it and move it here. So now I have to have parent and parent1. Yeah. So right now all of them are using exactly the same script, but if I want to, I can have variations of that script. So I could make my speed of rotation a public variable. So I'm just going to make it public float. I'll call it rotation speed, and let's say I'm going to set it to 0.2 by default. So if I want to add this script to any object, by default is going to be 0.2, and then I'm going to take this variable and pass it in here. So basically what's happening now is this variable is storing this value, and then on update it's rotating my object using this value. But what's interesting, I made this public, so now you can see these values here. And so basically, so this is 0.2 by default. Let's change this to 1. So this one is much faster. So you can see its children are still set to 0.2, but this particular object is 1. And if I will press play, the parent should rotate much faster than everything else. So it looks something like that, right? So you can now go ahead, maybe select all of these objects and change their speed to like 0.1. So now all of these objects are rotating with a speed of 0.1, but all of these objects here, they're rotating with speed of 0.2. So just run that, see what that looks like. So you can see this is twice as fast than this, and you can start making interesting patterns. So let me just center that 0, 0. Oops, what's happening here? I think I selected all of them at the same time, and then when I centered them, I just literally placed all of them in the same place, which is, I think, might also be an interesting thing. Yeah, it looks something like that, but we don't want that. So just be careful which objects you're selecting. So I only want to select parent and place in the center. And I want to select this object here, also placed in the center. Maybe make it a little bit bigger, like that. And I will select my sprites and make them a little bit more transparent, like that. So, okay, so these objects will rotate slower, and this will rotate faster. Okay, so that's a nice pattern here. I could also maybe duplicate it one more time, so Control D. I'll make it larger like that. And then maybe make it even slower, like 0.5. And the sprites inside of this large object, I'm going to change the color of it. Let's go for something like yellow, orange, like that. Maybe a little bit more transparent. And yeah, just give that a go. Okay, so you can see we have our simple screensaver. It looks like this. Also, when you're pressing play, you can choose to maximize your game window. So this is what it looks like. So this is full screen. Or you can just keep it at focused or minimized. Focused. Okay, so we've got this going on. And so another thing, don't forget, we're using this rotation here, and I'm only changing it on Z, right? If you want to, you can add, well, you can pass the same variable if you want, but you can also add other rotations on X, Y, and Z. So we have X, Y, and Z rotation, which correspond to, our X, our Y, and our Z. So let's just pass something like 1, 2, and this will be different for all of the objects. So this should be a little bit, maybe too fast, but yep, it's very fast. But you can see it's rotating in 3D space though. So I'm just going to take that and slow it down. So 0.1 F. So make sure you put an F if you're writing a float. 0.1, 0.2 F. So these are, two different speeds for X and Y rotation. And we're only really controlling the top one. But if you want, you can make 3 variables. Okay, yeah, so this will be, similar thing but in 3D. Or rather, rotation on X, Y, and Z axis. Yeah, so yeah, important thing, just play with it. Also, maybe play with colors as well. So for example, we have our you know, background, change background, see what happens, because that also determines a lot, you know, of your final look of this little screensaver project. Could be something like that. I think this three-dimensional rotation is a bit much, so I'm gonna remove that. So we'll save it. Here we go. Okay, so you can see this is working, and you can also try to experiment with different shapes. Like for example, you know, this is simple radial design, so I can just move, you know, all of these objects here. I could introduce, let's say, 2 squares here like that. 1, 2. So let me just, so see these objects here, I don't really want them on the screen right now, so instead of deleting them, I'm just going to disable them. So even though they're still there, they're not going to appear in the game, and they also look faded here, so I'm not looking at them when I'm working with them. Okay, so here we got our 2 objects. So let's say if I gave them a parent, so this could be like here. Let's just make it like this, and maybe I'll make it a little bit smaller. So take these 2 squares, so basically one on this side and one on this side, and I'm going to parent them like that. Right, so now we will have this kind of rotation, okay? So then I'm going to recreate a similar thing that I did before. So let me just center it, 0, 0. And it's also always a good idea to click on your parent and center it on children, so you should find like a better location. So here's my parent, and I can just duplicate that, move it here, and you know, I will recreate a similar thing here. So Control D, Control D, Control D. And so what I want to do is I want to rotate these parents, but also children inside. Right, so I'm just going to literally select all of them and give them the same script. So let me just open all of them like that. So this is one way of doing it, and select them. So all of them are selected, and then just to check that I've selected all of them, we can switch to pivot point, local, and try to rotate them. And yeah, as long as you're rotating all of them, then all of them are selected, or even as simple as changing colors. And that's, yeah, I know that all of the objects are selected. So now I could add my rotation. Let's just keep it default as is. And so now all of them have that rotation. Parents, parents, parents. So I can just close that up and maybe add another empty game object. So this is also a parent, and I could just place all of them here and then center it on children. Game object, center on children, and maybe let's give that a rotation as well. So now, you know, we have multiple layers of parents and children here. So let's just press play, see what this looks like. Okay, so you can see it's quite an interesting pattern. You could also, you know, go ahead, select all of the objects. So what do we have here? So all of the, so not the main object because it doesn't have a sprite, but all of the parents with all of the children, I can select them and give them a different sprite. see what that looks like. Again, maybe it should be a bit more detailed. Maybe you should have more children. But I think for now it's okay. Let's just see. Okay, so you can see this pattern is much more interesting than the previous one. But I could also select these, go to center, global, duplicate it, and just make more of them like that, and change their color. So you can see I haven't selected all of them, because I'm not changing color of all of them, I'm just changing color of so only parents. So let me just open that up. So because there's so many objects, it's becoming a bit too long to do all of this, but let me just show you. So we'll select all of my, so all of the first parents and all of the children, and yeah, we can just change the color of these objects at the same time. Maybe like this. Let's center the parent 0, 0 like that. And let's give that a spin. So you can see what's going on here. This pattern is much more interesting than, let's pull up one of these objects, a smaller one, than this pattern. But again, you can add as many objects as you want. This is just good experimentation. But you can see we have a lot of objects spinning around here in different patterns. This is quite straightforward. So yeah, this is something to experiment with. Please give that a go and make interesting screensavers. Let me just do that. Turn them all on. Place them here approximately. Maximize screen, press play. Maybe a little bit too fast, but you can see very hypnotic.